In the spring of 1889, workmen
really
hired to
appreciate you coming
refurbish an
today.
aging manor house in the
This is a new
Connecticut River
chapter in your
Valley
life.
came
Make us
upon
proud.
something
Remember
no one
that.
in that household
The road ahead
wished
requires
to find. Concealed within a sealed recess between the original stone foundation and a later oak, paneled addition, they uncovered a bundle of 17 letters, bound with a strip of black ribbon that had grown as rigid as wire over the years. The foreman, who first opened the bundle, later claimed he read only the first 3 lines of the top letter, before folding it back up and leaving the property entirely. He never returned to claim his pay. The letters were addressed to a woman who had been dead for more than 3 decades. They recounted, with painstaking and incriminating detail, a chain of events reaching back to the winter of 1843. Events the Aldrich family, among the most esteemed names in Hartford County, had spent 40 years and a significant portion of their fortune trying to ensure would never be spoken of openly. What those letters contained did more than embarrass the Aldriches. It destroyed them. Within 18 months of that discovery, the eldest son had fled to Canada under a false name. The family estate was sold at auction to satisfy a cascade of legal claims. And the family patriarch, 81 years old, nearly blind, and still insisting that everything was a fabrication, died alone in a rented room above a druggist's shop in Middletown. Before we go further into the story of the Aldrich family and the letters that brought them down, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale like this one. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What city? What state? We want to know who is out there in the dark with us. Because the dark, as the Aldriches came to understand, has an exceptionally long memory. The Connecticut River Valley in the early decades of the 19th century was a place that held a deep faith in its own respectability. The towns lining the river, Middletown, Hartford, Wethersfield, Glastonbury, were old in the American sense, which is to say they had been established long enough that their founding families had forgotten what uncertainty felt like. The valley had grown wealthy through trade, river commerce, tobacco, insurance, and manufacturing. By the 1840s, Hartford was the kind of city that sent its sons to Yale as a matter of course and expected them to return, ready to manage money, manage institutions, and manage appearances in that order. That sequence, money, institutions, appearances, was no accident. In Connecticut during this era, appearances were a form of infrastructure. They sustained credit, which sustained commerce, which sustained the household, the name, and the social standing. The maintenance of appearances was not considered dishonesty. It was understood as the ordinary work of a civilized community, the upkeep of a shared fiction that allowed people of different stations to coexist under a common set of acknowledged rules. The rules in 1840s Hartford were intricate. They governed who could sit in which church pew, who could serve on which committee, who could be visited, who could be called upon, who required an introduction, and who merely a greeting. These distinctions mapped onto a social hierarchy that was never formally codified, but was understood by everyone within it as precisely and automatically as a musical score is understood by a trained musician. This was the world into which Patience Cobb had been placed as a young woman, and in which she had lived, as domestic servants live, simultaneously inside and outside the family's intimate life. She ate in the kitchen. She managed the household functions that made its social performances possible. She understood the machinery behind the performance in the way stagehands understand it, from a vantage point that gives you, if you pay attention, a more complete picture of what is actually happening than the audience ever receives. The Aldriches had been managing appearances since at least 1701, when the first of them, a man named Cornelius Aldrich, who had arrived from Rhode Island with modest capital and abundant ambition, purchased a plot of farmland along the river's eastern bank and began the slow work of becoming someone worth knowing. His descendants had done well by that project. By the time we reached the family's story in the early 1840s, they were in their fourth generation of Connecticut prominence. They owned the manor house that would eventually be renovated, a profitable interest in a Hartford insurance concern, a smaller property in Glastonbury, used for shade tobacco cultivation, and the kind of social position that doesn't need to announce itself, because everyone already knows it's there. The head of the family in 1843 was a man named Harlan Aldrich, then in his mid-30s. By all contemporary accounts, he was an effective and largely humorless man. He managed the insurance business with precision, served on the boards of 2 charitable institutions, attended services at Center Church in Hartford with a regularity that signaled status rather than devotion, and had been married since 1838 to a woman named Eliza née Starr, who came from a respectable Springfield family, and whom everyone agreed was considerably more perceptive than her husband, though no one would have said so to his face. They had 3 children by 1843. The eldest, a boy named Harlan Jr., called Henry within the family to distinguish him from his father, was 5 years old. There were 2 younger daughters. The household also included, in the manner of prosperous Connecticut families of the period, a number of domestic servants, a groundskeeper, and a woman named Patience Cobb, who served as housekeeper and had worked for the Aldriches since before Harlan Starr had married Eliza, since before he had taken over the business from his own father, since before, some said, the house itself had acquired its reputation for cold rooms and drafts with no apparent source. Patience Cobb was 53 years old in 1843. She was a widow whose husband had died of a chest ailment in the winter of 1831, leaving her childless and with no property of her own. She had come to work for the Aldriches as a young woman, and the house had in some sense become the whole of her world. She knew where everything was. She knew the habits of every room, and she knew, this will become significant, things about the family that the family did not know she knew. The winter of 1843 arrived early and lingered long in the Connecticut River Valley. By November, the river had already begun to show ice at its edges, and the roads between Hartford and the outlying towns had turned treacherous with a combination of mud and frozen ruts that made travel both difficult and, when a wheel broke or a horse stumbled, genuinely dangerous. It was into this winter, gray, close, and unforgiving, that the events began to move that would eventually be sealed inside a wall and forgotten, or nearly forgotten, for 46 years. The night of December 3, 1843, was not a night anyone at the Aldrich estate was meant to remember for any particular reason. Harlan Starr had returned from Hartford in the late afternoon, arriving as the sky was darkening over the river, and the temperature had dropped sharply from its midday level. The kind of Connecticut winter evening where the cold fields deliberate, where the bare trees along the drive stand in the failing light like figures that have chosen not to move. He had arrived in better spirits than usual, which Patience Cobb noted in her letters with the precision of someone who has tracked a man's moods long enough to know when a change in them means something. He had been in Hartford all day on business. He had returned with company. Eliza had supervised the children's supper and their early bedtime. The household's evening meal had been prepared and served in the manner it was always prepared, and served the good china for the dining room table, the lamps lit, the fire built up in the hearth, until the room was warm in the specific way of a house, with thick walls and good wood, and people who knew how to use them. The smell of the dining room that evening, which Patience Cobb recorded as an incidental detail, in a way that suggests she was simply noting everything she observed, rather than selecting for significance, was roasted meat and candle wax and the particular sweetness of apple wood burning. Daniel Ferris, 26 years old, recently engaged to be married, hired as a clerk in the insurance office, had arrived at the manor house that afternoon in the company of Harlan Sar and had been invited to stay the night given the worsening weather. He was, by Patience Cobb's brief description, a young man of pleasant manners and a certain eagerness to please that people in subordinate professional positions sometimes develop when they understand their advancement depends on the goodwill of a specific person. He thanked Patience Cobb for the preparation of the guest room. He carried his own bag upstairs. He was, by all visible signs, an ordinary guest in ordinary circumstances. This detail, the presence of Daniel Ferris, would become, in retrospect, the hinge on which everything else turned. What is known, or what can be reconstructed from the evidence that later emerged, is this: Daniel Ferris did not sleep in the guest room he was assigned that night. At some point between 10:00 in the evening and 3:00 in the morning, he was somewhere else in the house, and during those same hours, Eliza Aldridge was not in the bedroom she shared with her husband, who was, according to his own later account, sleeping with the help of a preparation of laudanum, prescribed for a recurring pain in his back. What is also known is that Patience Cobb, whose room was on the ground floor near the kitchen, did not sleep at all that night. She heard things. The house made its ordinary nighttime sounds: the settling of old stone against newer wood, the movement of air through corridors that had never been entirely sealed against the winter, the distant sound of the river, if the wind was right. But she heard beneath those ordinary sounds something that was not ordinary footsteps that did not belong to the pattern of a household at rest. A door that opened and did not immediately close, voices very low in the corridor, above the kitchen. Not words, nothing she could transcribe, but voices and a specific emotional register she recognizes: the low urgency of people who do not want to be heard. She saw, through a partially open door, something she was not meant to see, and she wrote it down. Not immediately, not that night, but within the following days, in a letter addressed to her sister in New Haven. A letter she ultimately did not send, but kept instead, folded inside a larger bundle that she added to over the following years, with the methodical, quiet precision of someone who understands that truth, if it is to be useful, must be preserved in a form that will survive. The morning after Daniel Ferris spent the night at the Aldridge estate, he left before breakfast. Harlan saw him off at the door and parted from him in the ordinary manner of an employer bidding a valued employee a comfortable journey. Eliza did not come downstairs until mid-morning. She complained of a headache. The children were kept in the nursery. 3 weeks later, Daniel Ferris resigned his position at the insurance concern, citing a desire to pursue an opportunity in Boston. Harlan provided him with a letter of recommendation that was, by the standards of such letters, unusually warm. Ferris departed for Boston in January of 1844 and did not, as far as the official record goes, have any further contact with the Aldridge family. But the official record, as Patience Cobb well understood, is not the only kind. What Patience Cobb had seen through that partially open door on the night of December 3 was not by itself necessarily the thing that unraveled everything. Affairs among the wealthy classes of mid-19th century New England were not precisely common knowledge, but neither were they unheard of. What made the Cobb letters? For that is what they eventually became, at least in the minds of the few people who knew they existed. Different, from a simple account of marital infidelity was what Patience Cobb understood about the context in which that night had occurred. To explain this, it is necessary to go back slightly further in the story, to the summer and autumn of 1843, before Daniel Ferris arrived at the manor house with Harlan Sutter on that cold December afternoon. In the summer of 1843, a young woman named Mercy Dunbar had come to work at the Aldridge estate as a household servant. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a farming family from Glastonbury, brought in to help with the increased labor the household required after one of the other servants had left to be married. Mercy Dunbar was, by all accounts, a quiet and industrious girl, not without intelligence, and possessing a directness of manner that Patience Cobb would later describe in her letters as both her greatest quality and the quality that most imperiled her. By September of 1843, Mercy Dunbar had attracted the attention of Harlan Aldridge Cesar in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Patience Cobb saw this. She had worked for the family long enough to recognize what she was looking at. She had also worked for the family long enough to understand that the correct response in the practical calculus of her position was to see nothing, say nothing, and file everything away in the part of her mind where other such things were already filed. What complicated the situation, and what gave Patience Cobb's eventual account its particular weight, was that Eliza Aldridge also saw what was happening. And Eliza Aldridge, who was, as everyone agreed, considerably more perceptive than her husband, drew a conclusion that her husband had apparently not considered. That the best way to redirect a dangerous situation was to provide a substitute for the danger. Daniel Ferris was not, in other words, a random choice. He was a young man of relatively modest means and significant ambitions, employed in her husband's own business, and therefore someone whose discretion could be reasonably counted upon. He was also, and Patience Commonary in Virginia recorded this with the careful precision of someone who understood she was writing history, someone for whom Eliza Aldridge had developed a genuine attachment over the preceding year through the ordinary social contacts of a businessman's household. Dinners, holiday gatherings, the incidental proximity of a small professional world. Whether Eliza's calculation was correct, whether she believed that redirecting her husband's attention by occupying her own was a rational strategy, or whether the rationalization came later to explain something that had happened for simpler reasons, is a question the letters leave open. What they do not leave open is the sequence of events, or the fact that Patience Cobb, from her position of invisible domestic authority, had observed most of it with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned over decades of service that the powerful are observed most accurately by those they have learned to look through. By the spring of 1844, Mercy Dunbar had left the Aldridge household. The official reason given was that she had returned to her family in Glastonbury. Patience Cobb's letters suggest a different story. They suggest that Mercy Dunbar had left because she had been given a sum of money and a clear understanding of what would happen to her family's tenancy on Aldridge land. The Dunbars rented from an estate connected to the Aldridge tobacco interest. If she failed to depart quietly and permanently, this too Patience Cobb had seen, and this too she had written down. The years following 1844 were, on the surface, years of consolidation and quiet success for the Aldridge family. Harlan Sester expanded the insurance concern. The elder son Henry was sent to a preparatory school in New Haven, then to Yale as expected. The daughters made respectable marriages. Eliza Aldridge became, as the decades passed, the kind of matriarch praised for her composure and charitable work. A woman whose early beauty had settled into a kind of serene authority. If she and Harlan Sir had an understanding between them, If the events of December 1843 had produced not rupture but a particular kind of equilibrium, a shared knowledge that bound them together in the way only mutual compromises can, it showed itself nowhere visible. They appeared to the world as they had always appeared. Patience Cobb watched all of this, and she continued to work for the family until her own age and failing health required her to retire in 1871, at which point she accepted a pension from the estate and moved to the home of a niece in Middletown. She was 71 years old. She took with her, in a cloth-covered document box that had belonged to her husband, the letters she had been writing and accumulating for 28 years. She died in 1875. The box passed to the niece, who had been told clearly and repeatedly not to open it, to hold it intact, and to surrender it if anyone ever came asking, only to Eliza Aldridge herself, or to her direct heirs, and only if they came asking honestly, which meant only if they came asking because they already knew what was inside. No one came. Eliza Aldridge died in 1877. Harlan Sar outlived her by 12 years, dying in 1889, the same year the workers opened the wall. In those intervening years between Patience Cobb's retirement and her death, and the years after, the Aldridge family went on performing the rituals of Connecticut prosperity with the automatic fluency of people who have never had reason to question whether performance and reality were the same thing. The manor house was improved, new rooms added to the eastern wing, the original stone foundations reinforced, certain sections of interior wall rebuilt to accommodate updated plumbing and heating arrangements. It was during one of these earlier renovations, sometime in the late 1850s or early 1860s, that the cavity in the wall had been created, or at least altered to its final form. Who placed the letters, there is not entirely clear from the documentary record, but the timing suggests it was after Patience Cobb had left domestic service. The question of whether she placed them there herself, on some final visit to the house, or through some intermediary, or whether they arrived in the wall by a different chain of hands, is one of the small unresolved questions the story leaves permanently open. What is easier to account for is why they were placed there at all, rather than burned or kept openly or surrendered to a lawyer. The answer, when you think carefully about the position Patience Cobb occupied, is not mysterious. A domestic servant who possessed documents damaging to her employer was not, in mid-19th century Connecticut River Valley, someone with many options for how to use them. She could not publish them. She could not give them to a lawyer in her own right, since the legal system of the period offered limited standing to a woman of her station, and no standing at all to someone making claims against a family like the Aldridges without substantial resources to sustain a proceeding. She could try to extract some benefit by threatening disclosure, but this was a strategy that required a willingness to be destroyed in the process, because the Aldridges had tools for discrediting a domestic servant that she had no tools to answer. What she could do, and did, was keep. She kept the letters because keeping them was the only form of preservation available to her, and she placed them eventually somewhere they would not be destroyed by accident or by the tidying impulses of a household that would otherwise have had every reason to clear out the papers of an elderly, retired housekeeper. A wall is not a safe, but a wall is permanent in a way that a drawer or trunk or document box left to a niece is not quite permanent enough. The wall held them for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. It held them through 2 changes of household staff, through the deaths of both of Henry Aldridge's parents, through the conversion of several rooms from their original purpose to new ones, and through the ordinary erosion of time on a house that is maintained but not loved, kept functional but not cherished, operated as a property rather than inhabited as a home. And then the workers came with their tools in the spring of 1889. And then the wall gave them up, and the foreman read 3 lines and walked away. And the story that Patience Cobb had spent 28 years writing down began at last its journey toward the light. The niece, whose name was Clara Howd, was still alive in 1889. She had kept the box for 14 years undisturbed. And when she read in the Middletown newspaper a brief item about renovations being undertaken at the old Aldridge estate, she made a decision. She did not send the letters to the family. She sent them to the family's lawyer. Not the current family lawyer, but the previous one, a man named Solomon Graves, who had retired from practice in Hartford and was known to have accumulated over his long career a quantity of information about powerful families that made him a person worth staying on reasonable terms with. Solomon Graves received the box from Clara Howd in April of 1889. He read its contents over 3 days. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to Henry Aldridge, Harlan Jr., now in his early 50s, the family patriarch in his father's absence. The second was to a man Henry Aldridge had never heard of, a journalist in New Haven. He sent both letters on the same afternoon. If you are finding this story as unsettling as we intended, you're in the right place. Leave a comment with your theory. What do you think Patience Cobb saw that winter night? What do you think Eliza Aldridge knew? Like this video and let us know. We will be back in the dark with you before the end. Henry Aldridge received Solomon Graves' letter on a Wednesday morning in late April. He read it standing in the hallway of the Hartford house, a newer townhouse than the old manor estate, purchased a decade earlier when the manor had become impractical to maintain. His wife later reported that she knew from the look on his face, before he had said a single word, that something had shifted in the architecture of their lives. The letter from Solomon Graves was, by the standards of blackmail, for that is ultimately what it was, performed with the careful indirection of a former lawyer who understood precisely how close to a line he could walk, a masterpiece of its genre. It did not threaten, it informed. It conveyed the existence of a collection of letters describing events involving the Aldridge family between 1843 and 1871. Then it noted that these letters had recently come into Graves' possession, and that he had read them with considerable attention. It expressed, in measured and almost sympathetic language, concern about what might happen were their contents to become known to persons outside the legal and confidential context in which Graves was sharing this information. And it concluded with a suggestion that a meeting between Graves and Henry Aldridge, at a time and place of Aldridge's choosing, might be productive for all parties. It said nothing about the journalist in New Haven. That letter, sent the same afternoon, told a different story to a different audience. Henry Aldridge did not respond to Graves's letter immediately. He was, by temperament, a man who did not act under pressure, who believed less in the way of men who have grown up watching power operate from a safe distance. That any problem can be managed if you do not panic, do not speak, and do not move too quickly. He spent a day and a half doing nothing visible, which is to say, he spent a day and a half doing a great deal internally, reviewing the family's exposure, considering who else might know about the letters, calculating what Solomon Graves might actually want versus what he had said he wanted, and trying to determine whether there was any possibility that the contents of those letters were different from what his own memory and certain suppressed family knowledge suggested they would be. He had known, in some general way, about events in the 1840s that were not discussed. He had known, in the way that children know things they have absorbed from the atmosphere of a household, rather than from any direct disclosure. That there were arrangements and understandings in his parents' marriage that were not for public consumption. He had not known about Patience Cobb. He had not known that 28 years of domestic observation had been transcribed with the care of someone who understood that testimony, to be credible, requires specificity, and that specificity requires attention, and that Patience Cobb had paid attention with a thoroughness that would have impressed a trained investigator. He had also not known, and this is the dimension of the situation that the letters made newly visible to him, how thoroughly his own childhood had been shaped by the management of a secret. He could look back now at certain things he remembered from his boyhood, the way certain conversations stopped when he entered a room, the inexplicable coolness that had settled between his parents during a period in 1844 that he had been too young to parse at the time and had since attributed to ordinary domestic friction. The departure of a household servant he had barely known by name, whose absence had not been explained to the children. He could look back at those things and understand, now that they were not random moments of domestic weather. They were the visible surface of something that had been carefully kept below the surface, specifically so that he would not understand it. This is one of the more disturbing features of the Aldridge story. Not only that harmful things have been done, but that the children of the people who did them had been deliberately kept in the kind of comfortable ignorance that would allow them to carry the family name forward without the weight of what they were carrying. Henry Aldridge had been raised, in other words, to be a vehicle for his family's respectability without being told what that respectability had cost, or who had paid the cost, or that the cost existed at all. He had been prepared for succession into a world that was already in debt in ways he was not permitted to see. What finally moved Henry Aldridge to respond was not the letter from Graves. It was a conversation 3 days after receiving Graves's letter with a distant cousin who lived in New Haven and who mentioned, in the course of an apparently casual social call, that he had heard something interesting. A journalist he knew, a man named Edwin Pell, who wrote for one of the smaller New Haven papers, had been approached with a story about an old Connecticut family. The cousin didn't know the details. He had thought Henry would want to know. He said it in the tone of someone who is doing you a favor and understands that favors have weight. Henry Aldridge understood, in the space of that conversation, what Solomon Graves had actually done. The letter to the family and the letter to the journalist had not been alternative strategies deployed in sequence. They had been simultaneous. Graves had not offered Henry Aldridge a private settlement in preference to public exposure. He had offered both at once, and the letter to the journalist was not a threat to be deployed if negotiations failed. It was already deployed, already in motion, and already introducing the story of the Aldridge family into a world that Henry Aldridge could not fully see or control. The reason for this, why Graves would take an approach that maximized his leverage but also maximized the risk of actual exposure, became clearer when Henry Aldridge began asking careful questions of people who knew Solomon Graves. What he learned was that Graves, now in his late 60s, was not well. He had a condition of the liver that his physicians expected would be fatal within the year. He had no heirs. He had, over a long career, handling the private disasters of prosperous families, accumulated a great deal of knowledge that he had never been able to convert to the kind of security he wanted. Not blackmail money exactly, but something more like acknowledgement, recognition, the satisfaction of being known, even by one person, as someone who had held power over power and had used it according to his own judgment. He was, In other words, not maneuvering for money. He was maneuvering for consequence. He wanted to see what happened. This understanding did not make Henry Aldridge's position easier. It made it considerably harder. Because a man who wants money can be bought. And a man who wants revenge has a price that can sometimes be identified and paid. But a man who wants to watch, who has arranged the pieces on a board and is simply waiting to see them move, is a man who is not, in any straightforward sense, negotiating at all. Henry Aldridge went to see Solomon Graves in Hartford at the retired lawyer's home on Asylum Street on the first Tuesday of May, 1889. The conversation they had that afternoon lasted, according to a note Graves made in his personal journal, which survived, having been acquired with his other papers by a Connecticut historical archive, for approximately 2 hours. Graves recorded only a few lines about it. He wrote that Aldridge had come in expecting to find something he could address and had left understanding that he was inside something he could not address. He wrote that Aldridge was, beneath the composure, frightened in the specific way of people who have spent their lives believing their family name was a form of protection and have just discovered it is, instead, a form of exposure. And Graves wrote one other thing, which would have seemed cryptic to anyone who did not know the full history. That Henry Aldridge had asked, at the very end of the conversation, whether there was anything in the letters about Mercy Dunbar that indicated where she had gone after leaving the estate in 1844. Graves had told him yes, there was. And Henry Aldridge had sat with that information for a long time before standing up, collecting his hat, and leaving. Because the letters did not only describe what had happened at the Aldridge estate in December 1843, they described what had happened to Mercy Dunbar afterward. And that, it turned out, was the part of the story that Henry Aldridge had not known and had not expected, and from which, once he understood it, he could find no way to emerge intact. Mercy Dunbar had not gone home to Glastonbury in the spring of 1844. This was the fiction the Dunbar family's tenancy on Aldridge, connected land, gave the family every incentive to cooperate with. Perhaps not a detail that anyone had checked. She had told her family she was going elsewhere. Her family, understanding the nature of the relationship between tenants and landlords in such matters, had told the Aldridges she had gone home. Both were true in the sense that each party stated something they believed would satisfy the other. Neither was true in the sense that it described what actually happened. What actually happened, according to Patience Cobb's letters, was that Mercy Dunbar had gone to Hartford. Not to the domestic service positions her family thought she was pursuing, but to the household of a woman named Griselda Vane, who ran an establishment on Commerce Street that occupied a category of Hartford life that everyone knew existed, and that no one in respectable society acknowledged by name. Patience Cobb had found this out not through any dramatic investigation, but through the ordinary channels of domestic servant communication in a mid-sized city. The networks of cooks and washerwomen and housemaids who moved between households and carried, along with laundry and market goods, the currency of what they had seen. The information had reached Patience Cobb in the autumn of 1844. She had recorded it with the same careful, unadorned specificity she used for everything else. She noted the address. She noted the name of the woman who had told her. She noted that she had confirmed the account through a second source, which she also named. And she noted, this is the line in Patience Cobb's letter that Solomon Graves had quoted verbatim in a separate memorandum he attached to the bundle, that Mercy Dunbar had not gone to Commerce Street of her own free choosing, but had been brought there by a man she named, a man who had received a payment from Harlan Aldrich, Sar. for the service of relocating a problem to a place where it would be, in all practical senses, invisible. The man named was a person Graves had been able to identify through Hartford city directories. He had operated in the 1840s and 1850s on the margins of a number of businesses that occupied the same oblique relationship to respectability as Griselda Vane's Commerce Street establishment. He was dead by 1889. Harlan Aldrich Sturr was dead by 1889. Griselda Vane was dead by 1889. And Mercy Dunbar herself, whether she was alive or dead, where she had gone, what had become of her, after the mid-1840s, was a question that Patience Cobb's letters could not answer. The trail in Cobb's account went cold in 1845. But Henry Aldrich did not need the trail to continue beyond 1845. He needed only the portion that existed. He needed only the fact that his father had taken a 17-year-old girl employed in his household, pressed upon her the kind of attention that a man of his position and her position in the year 1843 made impossible to refuse, or even to clearly name. And then, when the situation had produced complications he did not wish to manage, had paid a man to remove her to a place that was not, by any standard of the era or of any era, somewhere a person is taken as an act of generosity. Henry Aldrich had grown up believing, had been permitted to believe, perhaps encouraged to believe, by the careful management of domestic history that wealthy families conduct across generations, that his father was a stern but fundamentally decent man. The insurance business, the church pew, the charitable boards, the composure in all visible circumstances, these were the materials from which a son constructs a father. And those materials, as Henry Aldrich sat in his Hartford townhouse in the first week of May 1889 and read Solomon Graves' memorandum, were dissolving. This is where it is necessary to consider what the letters meant not only to the family, but to the specific historical moment in which they surfaced. By 1889, the United States had been debating for nearly 3 decades the meaning of what had occurred before the Civil War. What had been permitted? What had been concealed? What the comfortable classes of the antebellum North had known and chosen not to examine. Hartford in 1889 was a reforming city, or at least a city that understood reform as a public value, whatever private accommodations its prominent citizens made with the past. The newspapers covered labor questions, temperance, the condition of women, the responsibilities of the wealthy to the less fortunate. It was not, in other words, a moment when a story about a prosperous Hartford family and a 17-year-old servant girl could be received as a minor social embarrassment. It was a moment when that story meant something specific, and when the people who read it would know exactly what it meant. Edwin Pell, the journalist in New Haven whom Solomon Graves had contacted, was 34 years old and had built a modest reputation for covering stories about financial irregularities and the private behavior of prominent men. He was not, by the standards of the larger press, a powerful figure, but he was persistent, he was competent, and he understood that a story with documents, a story where someone had written things down in real time and those documents had survived, was a story of a different order than one based on memory and accusation. He contacted Solomon Graves to confirm that the documents were genuine. Graves provided him not with the letters themselves, but with his memorandum and with 3 specific passages, transcribed verbatim from Patience Cobb's account, along with the dates and contextualizing details that would allow a careful reader to verify them against public records. The address on Commerce Street, the name of the man Harlan Sestern had paid, the dates of Mercy Dunbar's employment at the Aldrich estate and of her departure. Pell spent 2 weeks checking what could be checked. The Commerce Street establishment was in city directories from the period. The man Patience Cobb had named had a documented existence. The dates of Mercy Dunbar's employment could be triangulated against parish records from Glastonbury, which listed her family and her own baptism. He went to Hartford. He asked questions of people who had known the Aldridge family in the 1840s. Most of them declined to speak. Two of them did not. One was a retired clerk from the insurance concern who had worked there from 1840 to 1855 and remembered Daniel Ferris with a precision that surprised Pell, given the 45 years that had passed. The other was an elderly woman who had been a neighbor of the Aldridge estate and said only that she had always wondered about that winter. And that some things you see you cannot explain away, no matter how long you try. Just when we thought we understood the shape of this story, the ground shifted again. If this history is sending a chill through you, the kind that comes not from the impossible, but from the completely, terribly possible, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. We are going deeper before we come out the other side. The story appeared in the New Haven paper on June 14, 1889. It was not, by the standards of later journalism, a long piece. It covered perhaps 4 columns, and it was written with the careful hedging of a journalist who understood libel law and the difference between what he knew and what he could prove. But it was specific. It named the Aldridge family. It described the general nature of the letters and the circumstances of their discovery. It reported what could be confirmed about Mercy Dunbar's background and employment at the estate. And it reported, in guarded but unmistakable language, the documented connection between Harlan Aldridge's sister and the Commerce Street establishment. The New Haven paper had a circulation of modest size, but stories travel in ways that circulation figures do not capture. This particular story traveled quickly. It was picked up within a week by a Hartford paper, and then by a Springfield paper, each with their own additions and framings, each adding the particular texture of a community that had known the Aldridge family in some capacity, and now found itself looking at what it had known through a new lens. The Hartford piece was notably cautious. Hartford being a city where the Aldridges had social connections that a local editor would have been aware of. But caution, when it takes the form of carefully worded non-denial, communicates almost as much as assertion. What the initial coverage did not include, because Pell had not yet received the physician's document, was any account of what had happened to Mercy Dunbar after 1845. The first article described her as a young woman who had been employed by the family and then removed from that employment under circumstances that raised questions. The questions it raised were serious enough. They situated Harlan Aldridge Sr. within a pattern of behavior toward a vulnerable employee that readers of 1889, not all readers, not readers everywhere, but readers in the kind of reforming northeastern city that Hartford and New Haven had become, were primed to evaluate with a severity that would not have been universal 20 years earlier. The temperance movement had changed certain conversations. The emerging discourse around the condition of working women, the investigations into industrial labor that had produced legislative attention in Massachusetts and Connecticut both, and the spreading influence of settlement house reformers who documented what actually happened to young women of limited means when the system supposedly designed to protect them failed. All of this had created, by 1889, an audience that knew how to read between the careful lines of a newspaper story and identify the reality being described. It did not fully know how to identify who was doing the describing. Patience Cobb's name did not appear in any of the articles. She was referred to only as a source whose written account had been preserved and authenticated. The question of who she was and why she had spent 28 years Recording what she had seen was left largely as an absence in the center of the narrative. This absence was noticed by some readers who wrote to the paper asking about it. Pell did not identify her publicly. He had made a decision when he understood the nature of what she had done and who she had been, that naming her served no purpose she would have endorsed. She had not wanted credit. She had wanted the truth to survive. It did not fully know how to identify who was doing the describing, but it knew exactly how to receive what was being said. And what was being said, even in the carefully hedged language of the first article, was that a man of significant social standing had used that standing to harm a young woman in his employment and had then used the resources available to him to make that harm disappear. It did not name Patience Cobb. It attributed the source of the documents to a legal intermediary, unnamed. It did not reproduce the letters directly, but it provided enough specificity that people who knew the family and people who wanted to know more had a framework within which to ask their own questions. And the questions, once started, did not stop. Henry Aldridge learned of the article the morning it appeared through a telegram from his cousin in New Haven. He had known it was coming. Had known since the conversation with Solomon Graves that the journalist already had materials. But knowing a thing is coming and experiencing its arrival are different states. And the difference in this case was considerable. He spent that morning making decisions. He did not respond to the article publicly. He sent a letter to the editors of 2 Hartford papers through his own lawyer indicating that the family reserved the right to pursue legal remedies for false and damaging publication. The Hartford papers ran brief items acknowledging the story and noting the family's response. What he did not do, and what this particular aspect of the Aldridge story makes significant, was seek out any information about Mercy Dunbar beyond what Graves had told him. He did not try to find her. He did not attempt to determine what had become of her after 1845. This omission was noticed by Pell, who wrote about it in a follow-up piece in August, and its significance was left for readers to interpret. The follow-up piece was the one that did the serious damage. By August, Pell had been in correspondence with people the first article had shaken loose. People who had known the Aldridges in the 1840s, people who had known Griselda Vane's establishment, and people who existed in that stratum of a mid-19th century city that keeps its own records even when the official records are silent. One of these correspondents provided a document that Pell had not expected to find, a record kept by a physician who had provided irregular services to Vane's establishment in the late 1840s. The physician was dead. The record had passed through a chain of transfers too complicated to summarize into the possession of a medical society that had not examined it. It contained, among other entries, a reference to a young woman referred to by a first name consistent with Mercy Dunbar's, receiving treatment in the spring of 1845 for a condition the physician's careful notation described in the language of the period, which was obscure, but which Pell had shown to 2 practicing physicians who confirmed its meaning without ambiguity. The follow-up article said, as plainly as it dared, that Mercy Dunbar had not merely been removed from the Aldridge household. She had been removed under circumstances that had produced consequences for her health and her life that the Aldridge family, specifically Harlan Aldridge Sarn, had subsequently done nothing to address or acknowledge. Whether Mercy Dunbar had survived this, whether she was alive in 1889, somewhere in New England, or beyond living under her own name or another, Pell could not determine. He said so in the article. He asked anyone with information about a woman named Mercy Dunbar, born in Glastonbury, Connecticut, approximately 1826, to contact him. 3 people did, and none of their accounts could be verified. One of them described a woman who had died in New Haven in 1852. One described a woman living in Springfield in 1889 under a different name, who might or might not have been the same person. The third sent a brief unsigned note that said only, "She survived." It was not signed. It had a Boston postmark. Pell published all three responses in a third article in October. He added a reflection of his own, which is perhaps the line most frequently quoted from the entire episode, that the records of powerful families are the records they choose to keep, and that the records of women like Mercy Dunbar are the records that survive by accident, in the margins of other people's accounts, dependent for their existence on the persistence of someone who thought they mattered. The someone in this case had been Patience Cobb. A widow, a domestic servant, a woman who had worked in a house for decades and had understood, in the particular way of people who are present, without being seen, that the truth of a household is not found in its formal documents or its public record. It is found in what happens at 3 in the morning, when the family thinks the house is asleep. The legal remedies Henry Aldridge had threatened never materialized. His lawyers, reviewing the specific claims made in the 3 articles against the documented bassist Pell had established, concluded that a lawsuit would produce discovery that would be considerably more damaging than anything already published. There was no suit. What followed was not dramatic in the way of legal proceedings or public confrontations. It was the quieter drama of a family's position simply ceasing to be maintained. Institutions that had included Aldridges on their boards found, in the months following the articles, that the association had become complicated. Business relationships that had depended on the social weight of the Aldridge name found the same thing. The insurance concern, which had been profitable for decades, found its management transition. Henry Aldridge was in the process of handing day-to-day operations to a younger partner, complicated by questions no one asked aloud, but that everyone was asking. Henry Aldridge's younger brother, a man named Charles who had built a separate professional life in Boston, severed contact with the Hartford branch of the family in the winter of 1889, and did not explain publicly why. His wife, it was understood, had insisted. Their children used a modified version of the family name in some contexts and their mother's maiden name in others, which was, in the social grammar of the period, a sufficiently clear signal. Henry Aldridge himself held on longer than anyone expected. He spent 1890 attempting to stabilize the family's position through a combination of public charity, donations to institutions, visible church attendance, the purchase of a memorial window for Center Church in his father's name, a gesture of posthumous rehabilitation that was received with a silence that told him everything, whenever it would work, and private legal maneuvering aimed at reducing the estate's closure to begin the accumulate around the margins of the story. Some of these claims were financial. Creditors and business partners who felt that the revelation of the family's history changed the terms of their relationships. Others were stranger and harder to manage. Descendants of people tangentially connected to the 1840s events, who had been given by the articles a language for grievances that had previously been unarticulated. The estate was put up for auction in the autumn of 1891. The old manor house, the tobacco property in Glastonbury, the Hartford townhouse. All of it went over the course of 18 months of legal proceedings to satisfy a combination of debts and settlements that the Aldridge family's reduced income and social position could no longer service. The auction of the manor house contents was reported in the Hartford Courant in a single paragraph, which noted that the house had The house had been purchased by a manufacturing concern that planned to demolish the original structure and use the property for a different purpose. It made no mention of the wall. Henry Aldridge left Hartford in 1892. He went to Canada, as had been reported, specifically to Montreal, where he had a connection through the insurance industry, and where his family name meant nothing. He lived there until 1907, working in a modest administrative capacity for a commercial firm, and died without having returned to Connecticut. Whether he died in peace or in something else is not recorded. Harlan Aldridge, sister, the patriarch, the man whose actions in the winter of 1843 had set all of this in motion, died in the Middletown rented room in the autumn of 1889, a few months after the first article appeared. He had been informed of its publication. His reaction, as reported by the druggist whose shop was below his room, and who was the closest thing he had to an attendant in those final weeks, was to say that it was all lies and fabrications, that he had never done anything that was not in accordance with his position and his times, and that the people responsible for spreading such material were no better than common criminals. He said this more than once. He said it with conviction. He was not, as far as anyone could observe, troubled by doubt. This is, perhaps, the most unsettling detail in the entire story. Not the events themselves, not the letters in the wall, not the trail of documents that Patience Cobb assembled across 3 decades, but the old man in the rented room insisting, until his last days, that he had done nothing wrong. Because he was speaking, in some sense, from inside the logic of his own world, the world in which his position entitled him to certain behaviors, in which the people below him existed primarily in relation to his needs, in which the management of consequences was simply what a man of his standing did when circumstances required it. He was not performing innocence. He believed it. Solomon Graves lived long enough to read all 3 of Pell's articles. He died in December of 1889, 6 months after sending the letters to his 2 different destinations. His personal journal, the one that survived into the historical archive, ends in November with an entry that is brief, and that does not, despite everything, sound like the entry of a satisfied man. It says only that he had hoped to know what had become of the girl, and that he did not, and that this would have to be enough. Clara Howd, Patience Cobb's niece, was never contacted by any journalist or lawyer. She had transferred the box to Solomon Graves, and had asked nothing in return except to know that it had gone somewhere that would do something with it. She lived until 1898. Whether she ever read the articles, whether she knew the outcome of what she had set in motion, is not recorded. The man who had done this, the man who had set every domino falling, was neither Solomon Graves nor Edwin Pell, nor any of the named participants in the unraveling. It was Patience Cobb, dead 14 years before any of it happened, who had spent 28 years of service to a family, writing down with careful and uncompromising attention the things they would have preferred to vanish. She had not done it, apparently, to destroy them. Her letters, in their tone, are not angry documents. They are witnessing documents. She wrote in the manner of someone who believes that what happens deserves to be recorded. Not because recording it will fix anything, not because justice is guaranteed, but because the alternative, the wall, the official version, the story that the powerful tell about themselves, is its own kind of harm. She was right about that. And the 4 men who walked off the property without collecting his wages on the day the wall was opened was, in his small and practical way, also right. Some things, once you have read the first 3 lines, you understand you are not going to be able to put down. This mystery shows us something that every era understands and every era forgets: that the records of the powerful are kept by the powerful, and that the records of everyone else survive by accident, by persistence, and occasionally by the stubbornness of a woman with a cloth-covered box and 30 years of careful attention. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Do you think Mercy Dunbar sent that unsigned letter from Boston? Leave your comment below. If this kind of history, the kind that lives in the walls and survives the families it witnessed, is the kind that keeps you up at night, then subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell and share this with someone who needs to hear it. We will be back in the dark. We will see you in the next story.